صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Brothers and sisters, we'll begin our program tonight with some verses from the Holy Quran. Please welcome Khadija with the salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. تبارك الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير، الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا وهو العزيز الغفور. الذي خلق 7 سماوات طباقا ما ترى في خلق الرحمن من تفاوت فارجع البصر هل ترى من فطور ثم ارجع البصر كرتين ينقلب إليك البصر خاسئا وهو حسير. ولقد زينا السماء الدنيا بمصابيح وجعلناها رجوما للشياطين وأعتدنا لهم عذاب السعير. وللذين كفروا بربهم عذاب جهنم وبئس المصير. إذا ألقوا فيها سمعوا لها شهيقا وهي تفور تكاد تميز من الغيظ كلما ألقي فيها فوج سألهم خزنتها ألم يأتكم نذير قالوا بلى قد جاءنا نذير فكذبنا وقلنا ما نزل الله من شيء إن أنتم إلا في ضلال كبير. وقالوا لو كنا نسمع أو نعقل ما كنا في أصحاب السعير فاعترفوا بذنبهم فسحقا لأصحاب السعير. إن الذين يخشون ربهم بالغيب لهم مغفرة وأجر كبير. وأسروا قولكم أو اجهروا به إنه عليم بذات الصدور. ألا يعلم من خلق وهو اللطيف الخبير. هو الذي جعل لكم الأرض ذلولا فامشوا في مناكبها وكلوا من رزقه وإليه النشور. أأمنتم من في السماء أن يخسف بكم الأرض فإذا هي تمور أم أمنتم من في السماء أن يرسل عليكم حاصبا فستعلمون كيف نذير. ولقد كذب الذين من قبلهم فكيف كان نكير. أولم يروا إلى الطير فوقهم صافات ويقبضن ما يمسكهن إلا الرحمن إنه بكل شيء بصير. أمن هذا الذي هو جند لكم ينصركم من دون الرحمن إن الكافرون إلا في غرور. أمن هذا الذي يرزقكم إن أمسك رزقه بل لجوا في عتو ونفور. أفمن يمشي مكبا على وجهه أهدى أمن يمشي سويا على صراط مستقيم. قل هو الذي أنشأكم وجعل لكم السمع والأبصار والأفئدة قليلا ما تشكرون. قل هو الذي ذرأكم في الأرض وإليه تحشرون ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين قل إنما العلم عند الله وإنما أنا نذير مبين فلما رأوه زلفة سيئت وجوه الذين كفروا وقيل هذا الذي كنتم به تدعون قل أرأيتم إن أهلكني الله ومن معي أو رحمنا فمن يجير الكافرين من عذاب أليم قل هو الرحمن آمنا به وعليه توكلنا فستعلمون من هو في ضلال مبين قل أرأيتم إن أصبح ماؤكم غورا فمن يأتيكم بماء معين صدق الله العظيم.
Brothers and sisters, tonight's talk is by Brother Ammar Asaria on recalling Islamic ethics, lessons from Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue. Please welcome him with a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Ammar is a physics graduate from Imperial College London, obtained his PGCE from Durham in 2012 and subsequently taught at a local school for 2 years. He's an active member of the community and is now a software developer. Please recite another salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم. Thank you for joining me today. I'm inshallah looking to talk about Islamic ethics today. Before I begin, I just wanted to ask, what do people think ethics is? Because the term ethics can mean quite different things to quite different people. So anyone have any ideas what we might mean by ethics? That's always good. No ideas of what ethics might be?
Good thoughts, good actions.
Okay, good actions, all right, good. A moral code, okay. Things we ought to do, all right. Okay, good, okay.
Philosophers say when they want to say morality, but it sounds a bit elevated.
Yeah, okay. And does anyone know what we would use as the Arabic term for ethics? Sorry? Akhlaq, yeah. And so if I asked what does akhlaq mean, would I get a different answer? So we'd think of akhlaq as slightly different to ethics. And this is quite interesting, because when we come to Islamic ethics, we're going to see that actually a lot of Islamic ethics is based around akhlaq, rather than actually looking at ethics in the way that we think of it more recently. And this is where Alasdair MacIntyre is quite interesting, because Alasdair MacIntyre also moves away from this notion of producing laws using ethics. And he moves towards something called virtue ethics, which is what Aristotle puts forward. So when I was putting together an idea for this talk, I thought it'd be quite interesting to look at Alasdair MacIntyre and what he says about ethics, and using that as a starting point to begin to look at Islamic ethics. So Alasdair MacIntyre, I don't know, for those of you who don't know, he passed away in May, so he just passed away quite recently. But he's one of the biggest modern philosophers on ethics. And he wrote a very famous book in the 80s called After Virtue. Prior to this, he used to be a Marxist. So he was quite influenced by Marx. He, all the way to the end of his life, he very much liked Marx's critique of modern liberalism. But he had problems with Marx. And After Virtue is actually his first critique of Marxism as well as modern liberalism. So it's quite an interesting book, because in this book, Alasdair MacIntyre puts forward the theory that all of modern ethics is just emotivism. It's just about convincing people of your argument and making them feel as though your argument is better for a certain ethical point than another. And he says that modern ethics has been reduced to nothing more than feelings, essentially. And he says there's no reason to take one ethical theory over another. And so he wants to correct this problem that we're seeing with modern ethics. And he says that the only way to do this is to move back to Aristotelian virtue ethics. So inshallah, in a short period, we'll come back to Aristotelian virtue ethics. But Islamic ethics is also very influenced by Aristotle. So the first ethical text that we tend to have in Islam is the translation of Aristotle's Ethics by Miskawayh. And then this is taken forward by lots of thinkers. So Ghazali bases his whole Ihya Ulumuddin on Miskawayh's work, which is basically a translation of Aristotle's Ethics. And inshallah, when we come to looking at Islamic ethics, I'm going to look specifically at what Ghazali says and how Ghazali formulates ethics in his Ihya Ulumuddin. So let us begin by actually thinking through an ethical question. So one of the questions that Alasdair MacIntyre looks at in his After Virtue is this question of abortion. Is abortion something that can be justified, or is it something that's wrong? So could someone just, I think someone just said wrong. Could someone give me an argument for why they think abortion is wrong? Did you say it was wrong?
Yes.
Yeah, why is abortion wrong?
According to our religion, it's really killing somebody else.
Okay, fine. So it's killing a baby.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right, good.
Sometimes it's okay.
Sorry?
Sometimes it's okay depending if it's affecting the mom.
Okay, fine. So if it affects the mother, okay, so if there are effects on the mother, then we can possibly justify this, right? Possibly? Yep.
It affects a couple of things on the second statement.
Yeah.
Like, not only is it physical effects, but emotional effects as well.
Okay.
And I just, the language that is being used when it comes to the impact that it has on the mother, all of a sudden it's a possibility, not a certainty. So I just wanted to flag that.
Okay. All right. Okay, fine. So how would you word it?
That it needs to be considered equally, yeah? That
Okay.
the physical and emotional impacts of carrying a child,
Okay.
depending on how that child has come to be, needs to be a serious consideration. And it is, when it is damaging to a woman, then that needs to be considered, and it should almost be equal to killing a child. Like,
Right, so if it was going to kill the mother, then fine, then that should be considered. But what about just something a little bit less death-related? So if we were just to think about the freedom of the mother, does the mother have the right to say that she doesn't want to have this baby?
It all depends on what stage you're at.
Okay, let's put this at the earliest stages. Let's say we're within the first few weeks. Okay, so where we've just reached 1 month, the mother's realized she's pregnant, and she is considering whether to have this abortion or not. Is it okay to have this abortion at that point? Yeah?
Well, I reckon one of the main factors is the quality of life that the child can receive. Like, for example, if that woman is maybe like she doesn't have much money, she can't support the child, you have to think about the quality of life that the baby's going to receive.
Okay. All right, fine. So possibly thinking about the quality of life of the baby. Okay, good.
When's the baby actually a baby? So when does it actually
Okay.
become alive?
Okay, so you think that's an important point, right? So when is this baby becoming a baby? Okay, so once it's a baby, we can't kill it.
Potentially.
Regardless of all of these different arguments, aren't we infringing on sort of God's position and God's system by taking the decision to end or like intervene in the natural order of things?
Okay, so we shouldn't be able to intervene in the natural order of things. Do we not do that a lot anyway? Okay, fine. Okay, good. So, yeah.
28-week barrier in some things.
Okay.
After that, the soul enters.
Yeah, so the 28 weeks is interesting. So I think in British law we say 28 weeks. I think it's 28. And I think that's supposed to be the, is it 28? For abortion.
Between 22 and 24 weeks.
Is it 22 and 24?
24 weeks will be
Yeah, and normally we take the age that that we've basically had the earliest birth, earliest survival of a baby outside of a mother. And I believe that that age is getting earlier and earlier, so this age may also get earlier. Yeah.
So I just think, little point, you're preaching to the converted, right?
I haven't said anything yet.
No,
I haven't put forward the
You're
point.
asking questions where people already know the answer.
Yeah.
What is correct Islamically. So I think,
Yeah.
are you asking us to take that out for a second?
No, keep that in. Let that be. Let your Islamic position also influence what you're thinking as well.
I'm not happy with this 28 weeks. 7
Okay.
months, that is. Way out.
Okay.
Way out.
So hopefully from this you can see that we have a whole host of different arguments that we can put forward for a certain point. So we've put forward a point that killing is wrong, okay? So this is like a moral law. We're taking into account the liberty of the mother, the freedom of the mother, and the point that this is her body and she has the right to make choices. This is another thing that can influence the decision that you make. And so MacIntyre asks the question, which one of these should we give priority to? Which one should we say is what makes the decision on this moral law? And what MacIntyre wants to say is there is no way in modern ethics of making that decision. It is completely arbitrary. Okay? So with modern ethics, you could put forward an argument for anything. So, the murder of Palestinians that Israel is doing. You can put forward an argument to say that that's justifiable. The Israelis are allowed to defend themselves. Okay? Why should we say that the Palestinians' defense is more important than the Israelis' defense? This argument can be put forward. It's not a good argument, but it can be put forward, right? And MacIntyre says, well, what criteria do we have for deciding which point should take precedence? Which idea that we're putting forward should take precedence? And MacIntyre says that what's happened with modern ethics is that we have the ethical ideas. We still have a lot of ethical ideas that come from our past Christian history. So we have lots of laws like killing is wrong, lying is bad. We have all of these laws that we know from the Christian period. And then we've tried to put some form of justification, some arbitrary form of justification for why we should have those laws. So in modern ethics, for those of you who've studied some ethics, you'll know that we have certain theories like utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is where you say the right thing to do is what creates the most pleasure. So you can maximize it. You can say it's for the greatest number of people. So the most pleasure for the greatest number of people is what the right thing to do is. You have other theories. So you've got Kantian ethics. So Kant puts forward a universal law that he says you can use to derive these ethical theories. But whatever ethical theory you take, MacIntyre says there's no real position for it. And he gives a reason for why there is no reason to justify this position. He says that in classical ethical thinking, what we had were three principles. The first thing is we had a human who had its human nature however it was. Okay? So we have a human being, we've got Bilal over here, and he is how he is, right? He hasn't been ethically trained, he hasn't completed his growth towards being a perfect human being as of yet. Inshallah, he will make it, right? But as Bilal grows, right, we have a certain end that we want to reach. We have a definition of what a good human being is. So we have human nature as it could be if it realized its telos, its end. Okay? Now this is something that modern ethics cannot reach out to, because when we have the advent of modernity, so around the 1800s, there's a rejection of Aristotelian ideas. And this rejection of Aristotelian ideas is what leads to the scientific revolution. But essentially what's rejected is the idea that everything has an end point that it reaches to. Everything has an end goal that it's trying to achieve. So a human has an end goal that they are trying to achieve. But modern thought rejects that idea. It says that there are no ends, there are no purposes. So the whole notion of liberalism is this idea that we have the freedom to do whatever we want to do, to realize whatever goal we choose we want to reach, but we don't decide that goal for the individual. Right? That individual is free to decide whatever they want to do. That's what liberalism is. Right? So it rejects this notion of an end. And because it rejects this notion of an end, ethics is essentially, rational ethics is a means to transition from being at some untrained state to being at your end goal. That's the whole point of ethics. It takes you from being how you are to being the best possible human, right? Or beginning to achieve becoming this best possible human. But because we've rejected point number 2, we are essentially just left with a human that is at whatever point it is, and some form of rational ethics. But this rational ethics now doesn't have an end that it's trying to reach. It doesn't have a goal that it's moving towards. And because it doesn't have a goal that it's moving towards, it's arbitrary. Anyone could put forward a theory to justify anything, and it's equally valid because there's no criterion to actually decide which theory is better. Right? So a lot of modern ethics has this idea of emotivism to it. So a lot of modern ethics says that what's right is whatever makes you, whatever you feel is essentially right. So it redefines good as being those things that make you feel good. Okay? And MacIntyre says this is all a result of this rejection of the end goal of humans, the telos of humans. And because we've got this, we're essentially in a position now where we can't make any valid ethical arguments. We can have debates, we can have moral debates, and they go nowhere. Two people will put forward their positions, and whichever one is the better speaker will essentially end up winning the debate. It's just rhetoric, nothing more. And so this is what MacIntyre puts forward in the first half of his After Virtue. He says that modern ethics has reached a position where it can really say nothing. And MacIntyre says there is only one way to escape this, and that is to go back to Aristotelian ideas, to actually define what the purpose of a human is, and then from there work towards a theory that creates that ideal human being. Okay? And so this is what Aristotle's virtue ethics is. Aristotle's virtue ethics is a set of virtues that allow you to achieve the ideal end human goal. And it doesn't go about stating that this thing is right and this thing is wrong. It's not a law-based ethics. It's an ethics based on character. So it tries to develop certain characteristics within you so that you can make a decision as to what is right and what is wrong. And that now begins to sound a lot like akhlaq. Right? That is what the purpose of akhlaq is, essentially. It's the idea of developing good character so that you can make the decision to decide what the right action at the right time to do is. Okay. So, MacIntyre says that the only way to decide if something is good is you have to think about the purpose of that object. So if I have a watch, how do I decide if this watch is good? For it to be a good watch, I have to have decided what a watch should do. The end goal of a watch is for me to know what the time is. So a good watch is going to tell me what the time is. It's going to do that in a way that's convenient. So it's going to do that in a way that hopefully I don't have to press 100 buttons as some of these modern watches make you do. Straight away I look at it and I can see the time, right? So a good watch is good at telling me what the time is. A farmer, what's a good farmer? A good farmer is a farmer that can produce lots of fruit and vegetable from the ground that they are working, right? So that's a good farmer. But because we know what a farmer is supposed to do, we can talk about what a good farmer is. So in the same way, to talk about a good human being, I have to know what the function of a human being is. What is it that a human being is for it to be a good human being? And so MacIntyre takes this forward and he develops a whole new set of virtue ethics, slightly different to Aristotle's. And the reason he makes it different to Aristotle's virtue ethics is because he wants to move away from Aristotle's biology, essentially. And it's Aristotle's biology that he rejects, and he tries to reformulate a virtue ethics. And it's quite interesting that in his later works, he actually rejects the virtue ethics that he puts forward in, or to an extent rejects the virtue ethics that he puts forward in After Virtue, and he reformulates it in the form of Thomistic virtue ethics, so Thomas Aquinas' virtue ethics. Which, quite interestingly, is influenced very heavily by Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina. So, he ends up putting forward something that's very similar to what an Islamic ethical theory would be as well. But at this point, I'm going to now leave Alasdair MacIntyre, and inshallah, we're going to now talk about what a human is in terms of Islam. So, Islamically, when we talk about a human being, we define these three things. We have the body, so the actual body that we inhabit. Then we have the ruh, the spirit. And the ruh is what Allah puts in. So in the Quran it says Allah blows his ruh into us. Right? So this is a part of Allah. This is the perfect nature, right? And essentially we have this perfect nature inside of us. So when the Quran talks about this notion of Nabi Adam being taught all of the names, this all of the names is because we have this ruh inside of us, all right? This perfect part of God, essentially, inside of us, right? And then we have the nafs. And Islamically, the nafs is thought of as the self. Okay, we translate it as the soul, but it is what we are. So we are actually this nafs. When our body ceases to exist, this nafs continues to exist. Okay? So once we die, we still have this nafs going forward. And what happens here is the nafs is now influenced by these two parts. It's influenced by the body and it's influenced by the spirit. The closer you get towards your spirit, the more the nafs becomes like the spirit, the more godlike you essentially become, the better you are as a human being. But the more you tend to move towards your body and move away from your ruh, so the more you are influenced by your emotional desires and the dunya essentially, the more you move away from the perfect, ideal human, right? So we tend to break down the stages of the nafs. So we have the idea of nafs al-ammara, nafs al-lawwama, and nafs al-mutma'inna. So the nafs al-ammara is the lowest sense of the body, where it's lowest sense of the nafs, where it's commanded by the body. It's essentially just following these base desires. And as you get to the highest position, the nafsul mutma'inna, it's essentially become in line with the ruh. You've now stopped being influenced by these desires and you're now reaching towards Allah. Okay? So this is how Islamically we define the human being. Now, this is of course a simplification. There are lots of different Islamic theories. So Islamic philosophers will have, several different Islamic philosophers will have put different theories forward on what the human is, but all of them come down to a sense of this, right? So there might be slight differences in how they express it, but they still do end up coming down to this. And Islamic ethics varies slightly depending on which field you're looking at. So in fiqh, for example, what is good is essentially taken to be the laws of fiqh. Now, I don't quite agree with that, and we'll come back to that, and we'll come to Ghazali's position on this as well. But some scholars in fiqh will say that the laws of fiqh are what is good. So as long as you are doing those laws, whatever the fiqh laws are, then you are a good person. Kalam has an interesting history of what's good and bad as well. So those of you who know the Mu'tazili Ash'ari debate, we have the Mu'tazilis putting forward a position saying that God himself is subject to good and bad, right? He himself, there is an external notion of what is good, and you can use this notion to judge what God says, right? So now this is problematic because you've created an external good, and so the Mu'tazili position ended up then being rejected by a guy called Ash'ar, and he rejects this position. He was a Mu'tazili himself, and then he comes out, he leaves Mu'tazilism, and he says that, no, you can't say that God is subject to an external criteria of what's good. God is everything, nothing is external to God. So what is good is what God says. Right? And so this is the Mu'tazili Ash'ari debate. And the Ash'aris are still around today. A lot of Sunnis tend to still be Ash'aris. But this Mu'tazili position has more or less died. We tend to say it exists in Shiism, but actually Shia philosophy takes over from this, and it puts forward a slightly more nuanced position, which is, it says that essentially God has created the world, and in this creation, he has created what's good. So the creation itself has a notion of what's good in it, and because God has created this notion of what's good, it applies to everything within this creation and it can't be changed. With the Ash'ari position, because good is whatever God says, on the day of judgment, God could essentially decide, oh, I've decided differently, what you did wasn't good, and he could send you to hell. And this becomes a big debate amongst the Mu'tazilis and the Ash'aris, whether God can actually do that or not. So the way that Islamic philosophers resolve this is they say within the creation, we have this notion of good that Allah has created. And because in the creation this notion is there, that is what will apply, and that will be the judge of us when we essentially end up going to heaven or hell. Okay, so Islamic philosophy takes over from the Kalam position, and it creates this notion of good within the creation itself. And Irfan essentially has a very similar position to philosophy. It talks about good, so of course, again, we have different Irfani positions, but someone like Ibn Arabi, for example, says that the good is based on the names of Allah, right? So our goal is to embody these names of Allah, become these names of Allah in the way that they materialize in the world. Because we can never actually become the perfect names of Allah, because otherwise we would be God. But we can become the way that they are embodied within creation, and that would be the perfect and ideal state of the human being, right? So we have all of these different notions of good. I'm going to focus today on Ghazali, on Ghazali's virtue ethics. So Ghazali puts forward virtue ethics, and he talks specifically about character. And he defines a character. He says, character is a stable state of the soul, one which causes it to perform its actions spontaneously and easily. Now this is interesting. So good character is when you are performing good actions spontaneously and easily, right? So someone who has been trained to have good character is doing these actions without having much thought, because they've been taught, they've been embodied with these virtues, without thought or deliberation. If this state is of the kind which causes good actions, i.e. those praised by intellect and religious law, the state is called good character, and vice versa for bad character, okay? So good character is those praised by intellect and religious law. So to an extent, the intellect can tell us what good character is. Okay, and so Ghazali defines 4 main virtues that we have to essentially try and achieve. Okay, so we have to try and embody these 4 virtues in the best possible way. So Ghazali begins in his Ihya Ulumuddin. So for those of you who don't know, the Ihya Ulumuddin is the reconstruction of religious thought, or not reconstruction. Ihya comes from the root haya, which is giving life. So revival, you normally translate it as revival, yeah. So it's this giving life to the religious sciences, right? So the Ihya Ulumuddin is Ghazali's attempt at making Islam come back to life. So he puts a similar criticism to what we hear these days. He says that religion has been taken over by just fiqh. Everyone is just having this fiqhi idea of religion. And what we need is to start developing good character. And Ghazali puts this point forward. He says that, let's take an example like fasting. You could fast, you could follow all of the laws of fiqh, not eat, not give in to your sexual desires. But at the end of the day, your fast could have absolutely no value. It could do nothing to raise the state of your soul. So just following the law is not enough. To make yourself better, you have to do more than just follow the law. And so in his book on fasting, he gives a whole series of things that you need to be trying to work on to improve the state of your soul. So Ghazali says that the fiqh is essentially the lowest level of what you can do. It doesn't embody what is good. It's basically the boundaries within which you act. But you've got to do so much more than the fiqh to actually reach a high status. And so the first virtue that he talks about is that of wisdom. Now, with all of the virtues, Aristotle does this. He talks about if you have too much of that virtue, then you can embody a bad state. And if you don't have enough of that virtue, then you can also reach another bad state. So the best state is the mean, is the middle ground between the two extremes. And so Ghazali does the same. So he says too much wisdom can lead to deceit, and too little of it leads to stupidity. So we are taking a position between deceit and stupidity. That's the ideal position that we want to reach. And he defines wisdom as two types. He says there's theoretical wisdom. This is knowledge of God. This is the best possible wisdom you can have. And he says knowledge of God in itself is not enough. You need to have more than just knowledge of God. You need to also have love of God. Okay? And he talks about practical wisdom. This is perceiving the right from the wrong and being able to make this decision between what is right and wrong. And throughout his book, he refers to all four of these virtues, and he talks about how you can build these. So the first virtue he talks about wisdom. The second one he talks about is courage. So the extreme of courage is recklessness, right? It's when you do things without thinking about the consequences. The not having enough courage leads to cowardice. And Ghazali extends courage a lot further than what Aristotle talks about courage. So he talks about things like fear of Allah being a courageous state, right? So to reach a state where you are fearing Allah correctly is courageous. Because this is going to a level where you actually begin to know God. He talks about jihad being the way that we reach this courageous state. So in the physical world, we have the physical jihad, which is fighting, but we also have the struggle against the soul. And Ghazali says that this is the most important jihad, and we have to be struggling against the soul in order to achieve this courage. He says another thing that's required for courage is the control of your anger. And interestingly, he puts gentleness as a sub-virtue to courage. Aristotle does not consider gentleness as a virtue. He considers it as a vice. So it's interesting that Ghazali begins to now play with these virtues, take some of the virtues that Aristotle is using as vices and starts using them as virtues himself. And he also talks about the correct evaluation of the self. So a courageous person is able to evaluate his self and go between arrogance and humility. And he doesn't put humility as an extreme, he puts humility as an ideal. So humility is a good position to reach. The next virtue he talks about is temperance. So temperance is the control of your desires. So he talks about it as being having not enough control being self-indulgence, and having too much control being insensibility. So mainly when he talks about control of desire, Ghazali talks about controlling eating, drinking, and sexual desires. So he mainly focuses on these two things. And he puts this book, so his Ihya Ulumuddin is a 40-volume book. He puts the book on controlling these two desires straight after the book on improving the soul. So he puts this as being the most important thing in realizing the improvement of the soul, is controlling these base desires. And he goes into detail on how we can build these virtues to control these desires. And with Ghazali, it's very interesting. He says that the actions that we need to be doing are at the very extremes in order to reverse things. So for example, to control the desire of eating, he talks about fasting. But not just fasting in the sense we fast in Ramadan, where we break our fast at the time of Maghrib. He talks about going beyond that. He says that people who achieve high levels of the soul will actually fast for several days on end, just having water to break their fast. And he says that this is the way that you can develop the soul. So he says that you have to go to the very extremes in order to suppress some of the base desires that we have. And lastly, he talks about contentment being something very important for temperance, right? So contentment, being in a state where you're content with what you have. Very, very important to reaching temperance. And he ends with justice being the fourth most important virtue. And justice, he talks about being the control of all of the other virtues. So knowing which virtue to give precedence to in whichever circumstance you are. And so it's very interesting how he develops this and how he develops this notion of trying to perfect the character. He doesn't want to go into talking about certain laws and certain ideas within his ethical theory. He wants to talk about how do we build our character. And this is something that we tend to forget very often. And I think Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin is one of the most important works on this. And it begins to give us a lot of space on how we can develop and build this character. I'm going to end there and not go into too many other side issues. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. So thank you very much.
Ammar, thank you. Before I ask the question, just to remind you that your dad, Marhum, when he was talking about Ihya Ulumuddin, he said one of Ghazali's criteria was that the stomach should touch the back, so that the whole thing disappears. That's the level of fasting.
Yeah.
That's still in my mind fresh. But what I'm asking is this too. Is ethics possible without belief? That's one. And the second one is that, you know, ethical conduct and morality, is it inherent? Is it what we call fitra, for example? Is it inherent in human beings or is it not? Because that will then go against the whole present day ethical codes.
So the question of whether ethics is possible without religion, my answer to that is very similar to what Alasdair MacIntyre says, which is no, right? Ethics requires some form of defining what the self is, and that only comes through a metaphysical theory, which comes from religion, right? So I think that religion is a fundamental belief in a creator, right? If you don't have the notion of this creator, there is no truth that you can aspire towards, right? So yeah, I don't think ethics is possible outside of religion. And your second question on fitra, yeah, fitra is very important towards this, right? So we are built with a certain condition, right? And ethics is all about perfecting that condition, allowing that fitra to come out and to materialize. And so it's quite interesting. Ghazali talks about this story in his Ihya Ulumuddin. This was a story that Eleanor actually came over here from Khayal Theatre. She came and she told the story of these two artists that are called and they're asked to compete against one another. And in the middle, they put up a curtain and they say, all right, this side, one of the artists develops his picture. On the other side, the other artist develops their picture on these large walls. And so the one artist goes away, draws lots of things, really beautiful, elaborate thing on the wall. And the other artist just polishes the wall. polishes and polishes and polishes the wall. Then when that veil is removed in the middle and they look at this, the polished wall reflects the beauty of this other image that has been drawn. And not only does it reflect it not only does it reflect it in a way that it shows the other image, but it makes it look more beautiful. It begins to sparkle and glisten because of the way that the sun is shining on it. And so Ghazali says it is the same thing with our hearts. We're just polishing and shining it so that this fitrash can shine outwards, right? So that we can reflect perfectly this state of Allah.
Thanks so much. It was such a brilliant. Thanks so much. Such a brilliant talk. I'm familiar a little bit with MacIntyre and also Ghazali, but I'd never thought of putting them together like that. And I think it is really resonant when you think about these somehow intractable moral debates we have, and if you don't have a sort of central point how it works. But my question is one of my critiques of MacIntyre, so I'll throw it back at you if I can make it make sense. A lot of this seems to make a lot of sense at the level of the individual. Right, your individual ethics, training yourself as a person in order to be better, and that beautiful idea that Ghazali was talking about, it becomes easy and natural just to do good, and that as a sort of practice. But the problem is that with Aristotle, he was living in a small city-state where only men had authority, only citizens and certain men had authority. And I think he was thinking very much of what their end point or teleos was. He also would have thought that slaves would have their own teleos, and that was completely normal for them just to be slaves, or women having a certain role, or, you know, so in societal terms, when we have a society now which is much more to do with equality, which is much more diverse in terms of like different communities, societies, ethics, when you're talking about the abortion point, everyone here can come up with their different points of view. The state has to like arbitrate in a sense between that. It doesn't force you to have an abortion, it just allows that to happen in law. You as an individual can choose not to, or assisted dying, which is what I'm thinking a little about at the moment for various reasons. Like, so how does this translate into state and law? Because that seems to be the really complicated bit, and where MacIntyre's like Marxism and his Aristotelianism and his Catholicism is like he's got quite a lot of love for the big, overarching, like, big system, big institution that will basically, you know, to put it simply, would we want the British government to lay down the teleos for all of us? If you see what I mean.
So I think this is actually a critique of the modern state itself, what you're putting forward, to an extent, right? So with MacIntyre, I didn't go into this, but MacIntyre follows Aristotle in putting forward this notion of the common good, right? And so the common good is this idea of what's best for the society. And Aristotle does a lot of this, and that's how he develops his politics, right? And as you said, yeah, there may be difference in terms of goods for slaves and other people, but I think it's possible to come towards a common good for people. And what's interesting with Ghazali is he doesn't talk about the social aspect at all. So when he develops his virtue ethics, he rejects all of Aristotle's social aspects. And he just talks about the development of the individual. So I don't think Ghazali's ethical theory is by any means complete and can actually lead to a complete ethical theory for the entirety of a society. And I don't have the answer for you. I don't know how we resolve these issues, but there is an issue. So if abortion is wrong, if it is the murder of a baby, then surely it's problematic for the state to allow that. So if there is a position where that's the case, then should the state be allowing that? Should it be accepting all different forms of morality? Or does there have to be a position that is taken or at least a means of reaching a position where we can decide on what's right and what's wrong?
I don't want to hog it back. You get to the sense of them all about, you know, people having affairs, or like all personal intermorality thing, which we can be very sort of defined in terms of what we personally think about it, but at the same time not necessarily wanting the state to sort of snooping into people's lives and trying to make decisions and adjudicate on where the state's authority has to sort of be pushed back. And that's where liberalism is useful, isn't it? Because it can just sort of push back against the state and allow space for people to sort of develop their own morality in a way that they develop their own virtue ethics, which isn't like the law telling you to be good. You actually have to develop that for yourself.
So it's interesting that you say that. That is what the argument is for liberalism, right? It's this notion that we've created a space for the individual to make the decision towards what end they want to move towards. But what we're seeing, at least in modern times, more recently, is a complete loss of purpose, right? And so an increase in things like depression, increase in people not having the notion of where to go or what to achieve. And so people like Jordan Peterson can come along and they say, oh, clean your room. And all of a sudden, people are, oh, wow, this guy's giving me purpose. And they're all following behind him. So we have this massive problem where we've got this loss of purpose. And we're seeing it happen more recently. So whilst liberalism does give that space, it also tends to create this end where we have a purposeless society. And it begins to have that reflection on the individual itself.
Ammar.
Wa alaikum salam.
Just a quick one. Is there a reason why you omitted altruism and egoism in your discussion?
Omitted from what?
In terms of the balance between...
Okay.
You mentioned utilitarianism, right?
Yeah.
So what about egoism and altruism? Isn't it
as different ethical theories? I mean, there are so many different ethical theories. If we went to list all of them, we would be here for a very long time. If you were to do ethics course in a university, initially they used to teach Kantian ethics, utilitarianism. Those were the two main fields. And then Alasdair MacIntyre's book comes after Virtue.
Basic
a few other thinkers come.
Freud, right? So
Alasdair MacIntyre's book comes, and then Virtue Ethics gets added to this. But
in Islam, where does egoism come in and altruism come in?
So egoism is what? A centralization of the self? Is just following your...
So egoism makes you do the right thing, right? So you need egoism, you need the ego, but it's the balance between overpowering and doing the right thing. Whereas altruism is you sacrificing your own self for the good of the others, right?
Okay. So when we were talking about the self, the nafs, the ego, I guess that is the ego, right? And that's what we are developing, right? So I guess that's what I haven't come across that as an ethical theory, egoism. So.
But isn't the reason why society, like you said, is getting a little bit different now is because ego is taking over with leaders. So we have a lot of leaders who are pushing their ego as opposed to the greater good of the society, right? So that would be, rather being altruistic, it's ego.
Yeah. So exactly. And actually MacIntyre, I didn't go into his full development, but he does develop this very notion. He says that morality essentially falls into being the most powerful utilization of it to subjugate the masses, right? And that's essentially what you're saying. Yeah. So that's exactly what MacIntyre says. He says that's what morality has become in the modern world. It's just a bunch of more powerful people who have a voice subjugating others and using ethics as a way of doing that. And so it's so interesting, again, when we look at Israel-Palestine and the International Court of Justice. So when Israel was first investigated by the International Court of Justice, we had some of our leaders saying, this is something that's used for for people in Africa, for black folk. Well, why are you using this on our allies, right? And so we see that exact notion there, right, of what MacIntyre is talking about.
Any more questions?
Salam Ammar.
Walaikum salam.
A lot of your talk went over my head, so maybe this is a simple question. You said that you can't have proper ethics without religion, or like you need some sort of religion to give you, I'm guessing, some sort of axioms to make it work in that sense. So for people who decide that they have no faith, right, but they still try and put forward modern ethical arguments which are justifiable, what sort of axioms do they need to concur to get to, you know, a foundational knowledge or foundational way of trying to proceed with this? Or is my question doesn't make sense, maybe?
So MacIntyre would say that they have to have a telos, an end, right? So what is the perfect human, essentially? And I don't know how they would go about defining that. It's very difficult to do without a religious state. So my answer to that is I don't know. I don't know how they could possibly develop this outside of ethics. Outside of religion.
Any?
Sorry, this religion, does it have to be Abrahamic religion or any sort of faith or belief system? Scientology or anything?
So, I mean, I think a lot of these things would give you an end, yeah?
Okay.
I mean, he's not here sitting and deciding what the perfect ends are or anything, right? But MacIntyre's argument is that without defining an end, you can't have ethics. And that's the problem that modern ethics falls into, because modern ethics doesn't want to create an end, because it wants to say that you have the freedom to decide what that end is yourself. And so he's saying, if you take modern ethics, you can't possibly have, if you take modernity, you can't possibly have an ethical theory.
Salam Ammar. Thank you for your talk. I found it interesting just to go back to when you were looking at Ghazali's sort of axis, or like his different outlines of character. Am I right in thinking that there were four main sort of subgroupings that he had roughly built on from Aristotle's framework as well? Is that a right way of understanding it?
Yeah,
or?
so if you have looked at Aristotle's virtue ethics, these are the exact same virtues that Aristotle puts forward, right? But he modifies what they mean to quite a large extent. So it's not the same as what Aristotle says in terms of what they mean.
He adapts it to the sort of sensibilities or the sort of ethical framework of his time instead. Is there a reason why, or to your understanding, is there a reason why Ghazali chooses to do that, rather than having the confidence to say that he has, or he's building on an Islamic framework, as you outlined? We have other sort of Islamic viewpoints as to what you could put your foundations in to build an ethical framework for, whether it's Asma al-Husna, whether it's the Sunnah itself, like things that the Prophet has done and Imams have done. Is there a reason why he doesn't have the sort of philosophical confidence to say, we have our own framework and our own revelation to be able to put these foundations down and say, this is what makes a good human and a good character? Why does he have to go back to Aristotle and say, right, here's some random Greek who had a flawed idea of what it means to be a man or a woman or someone in this world, and why do we have to go back to that and build up on it?
So Ghazali is very interesting. So Ghazali, he builds his stuff on Miskawayh's work, right? So Miskawayh's ethical work has already transformed Ghazali slightly into an Islamic framework. And when Ghazali reads Miskawayh's ethical work, I think he sees it as a useful tool, right? So the Ihya Ulumuddin is filled with hadith, right? That is its hadith, and the Quran is its main source of talking about how we build this character. And what Ghazali is doing here is he's using these 4 virtues as a nice kind of overarching thing that he can place all of these hadith into. So I think he sees it as just a useful tool, right? And I was thinking about this myself. I thought, all right, let me come up with my own Islamic ethical theory and let's not go with Ghazali. I was like, what would I pick as the virtues? And I was a bit stuck, which is why I went down presenting what Ghazali's virtues are. So I don't think that it's quite so easy to come up with 4 overarching virtues or several overarching virtues. What's interesting is, I don't know if you remember, a few years back, Fatimi came and gave a talk here. And he was talking about different ethical theories. And he was talking about developing a virtue ethics where tawheed was one of the virtues. So maybe there's something quite interesting in looking at what we can add to these virtues or change.
Thank you very much, Ammar, for that talk. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Just a reminder that on Friday next week we have the Wafat of the Prophet, which would start with Niyaz and then Salah, followed by the main talk. Please do join us. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.